Welcome to Brainfluence. I'm Roger Dooley. I'm super excited about today's guest. Stephen M.R. Covey is not only a New York Times and #1 Wall Street Journal bestselling author, his book, The Speed of Trust, has achieved classic status with over 2 million copies sold. I guess I can account for a couple of those with both audio and paper versions in my library. He's the former president and CEO of the Covey Leadership Center, and he co-founded and currently leads Franklin Covey's Global Speed of Trust practice. Trust me, this will be an interesting conversation. Welcome to the show, Stephen.
Hi, Roger. So great to be with you on this podcast. Very excited for it.
Great. Well, I'm excited because your new book is Trust and Inspire, and it builds on the ideas in the Speed of Trust. You've devoted a good portion of your life to promoting the concept of trust, Stephen. I know you've obviously filled books with answers to this question, but why is trust so important?
Yeah, it's because it really makes our world go round. Just try to imagine a world without trust. Try to imagine a relationship without trust in terms of being enduring and happy, an organization without trust, a team. And so we kind of have always assumed trust, take it for granted until we lose it. I love how Warren Buffett put it. He said, trust is like the air that we breathe. And when it's present, we don't really notice, but when it's absent, then everybody notices. And so we're seeing increasingly today in our world kind of an absence of trust, a loss of trust. And so the need to become intentional and deliberate about building trust in a world of declining trust has never been greater than today. And it matters enormously because it affects the speed at which we can move. It affects the cost of everything. It also makes life more fun and pleasant, and organizations happier, and just everything good we want will increase with trust. And so it's really a underestimated performance multiplier and energizer for people, for relationships, for organizations. And so I think it's just vital in our world today, in a world of declining trust.
I think it's so important, and you couldn't be more correct about the lack of trust. And I think it's obvious at the political and governmental level. And you would think maybe businesses would be a little bit more immune from that, but I still see certainly a lot of practices that are like that. One of my favorite quotes from The Speed of Trust is that low trust creates friction or causes friction. And I've been focused on friction, not quite for as long as you've been focused on trust, but you use that word in a sort of all-encompassing sense, including interpersonal friction. I focus more on friction in terms of wasted effort, bad processes, things that waste employees' time, waste customers' time and effort, and often lead to worse business results. But when I talk about friction, I sometimes get pushback that, oh yeah, we know all about that. And my counter to that is, well, if everybody knows about it, then why is there still so much of it? I'm wondering if you have ever have sort of the same feeling about trust, that people say, oh yeah, we understand trust. Yeah, we're very trusting, but the actuality is different.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Get the same kind of comment of, who doesn't believe in trust, right? Everyone believes in trust. And yet so much of our organizations are designed for the 3% of the people that we can't trust, not for the 97% that we can. And we create policies and procedures for the few that can't be trusted and penalize the many that can be. And processes and all the like our organizations are filled with it. And I just was with I mentioned this in this Trust and Inspire book. I visited a university where they were recruiting this superstar professor to come in, and they put the red carpet treatment for him, and the president, everyone came out, and he loved the visit. He had reasons he wanted to move there to this school, and this would be a coup to land this professor because he was in such demand. But then it came time to get reimbursed for his trip. And on his expense report, he literally had to produce evidence of his paper ticket, not just the receipt, but the actual stub that showed you use it. But he didn't use a paper ticket. He used his phone. And so he said, well, I didn't use a paper ticket. And they said, well, I'm sorry, we can't reimburse you without a paper ticket stub. And imagine where did that policy get put in place? It probably got put in place because someone along the way probably created a fake ticket, got a reimbursement, and they said, well, gosh, because this one person did it, now let's create a rule that penalizes everyone and cause this visiting professor to say, why would I want to come to this school where they don't trust anyone? And it was never intended that way, but we put in place controls, policies, procedures designed because of the lack of trust, and it tends to perpetuate itself, and it creates a lot of friction. It slows everything down, and it increases costs. And I call it a tax. It's a low trust tax, and it's very real. As Emerson says, our distrust is very expensive. It creates a lot of friction.
Yeah, it's funny. In my book, I talk about expense reporting too, in my own experiences, but I won't get into now, but just how these ridiculous rules ended up making things take far longer, not only for the employee who had to comply with all these documentation requirements, but then for the accounting people who had to verify that all the the requirements were met. A recent book I've enjoyed is No Rules Rules, about how Netflix pretty much eliminated all their rules and practices like that, including those related to expense reporting. They basically said, hey, do what's smart, do what's good for the company. If you're doing what's good for the company, then it's okay with us. And if somebody does something that turns out to be dumb, well, they'll be told about it. And if they keep doing it, maybe they'll have a problem. But, it's a system built around trust. So
I loved No Rules Rules. I read it as well. And it's a great example of what I'm talking about in Trust and Inspire, because their whole premise is freedom and responsibility. And so, they try to hire good people, and they're constantly trying to, what they call, increase talent density. And then they're trying to increase the candor. So it's very real. And then they're trying to release controls, release the rules, release the policies. So they get rid of that friction, and they're giving people more freedom. But with that freedom comes responsibility. And people tend to live up to the responsibility, and they find that just a better way to run an organization. And it's also a better way to be creative and innovative and to collaborate and to do all the things we're trying to do, and to create a great culture that inspires people when you trust them, when you give them freedom and get rid of the excessive policies, procedures, rules, regulations that often scream distrust and have that, that counterfeit effect of causing everything to slow down and cost more, the friction you talk about.
What do you say to executives who might say, well, okay, that's fine for Netflix because they've got all these really smart, high-end, high-salary employees have been carefully recruited, but I can't extend that level of trust to my people, to our people in our company. How do you push back against that?
Yeah, well, I think that you do look at context. Context does matter, and you got to be smart about the trust being given. But you'll find that in most situations, sure, there might be a risk to extend trust, but quite often, maybe more of the time, the greater risk is not to extend the trust, because of all that you have to do, the policies and procedures you put in place, the levels and the layers, the redundancy, the bureaucracy that tends to get put in place in lower trust environments. And we've become very good at kind of measuring the cost of trusting too much and being wrong, but we're not very good at all at measuring the cost of not trusting enough, and what it does to people, how it saps energy and joy, and how, like the example you give on your expense reports, often the oversight function over this, the verification function, tends to be far more expensive than any little violation that could happen here or there. And so we've got to look at both sides of the equation, not just what if we trust too much and are wrong, but what if we don't trust enough? What are the implications of that? And if you balance it out, you can kind of come up with a good, a good approach to it that's smart. I'm not advocating a blind trust, but a smart trust with expectations and accountability. I'll give you one quick illustration that's a non-traditional, it's not a knowledge worker company like Netflix. In France, it's a foundry, an automobile manufacturing foundry component company called Covey. So they're in France, a lower trust society, relatively speaking, in terms of, the word bureaucracy is a French word. So, so there's lower trust generally in a manufacturing setting, a foundry, but they had time clocks, they had all the traditional things. And they said, look, we're going to change how we approach this. And we're going to lead out with trust. And we're going to have clear expectations and agreed upon process to accountability to those expectations. But we're going to trust people and get rid of the time clocks and get rid of all the controls they had put in place. They would have self-control, self-governance through expectations, accountability, through building a culture. And they have had extraordinary success. They haven't had, a late shipment in decades. And they are a huge, fast-growing market share foundry that is outperforming the competition, all on the premise of a whole different model of trust in a manufacturing industry, in a bureaucratic society. But they found there's a sweet spot to do it. So again, I'm not Pollyannish on it. You got to look at the data, but the data is pretty overwhelming that high trust organizations outperform low trust organizations by about 3 times in the economics, in total return to shareholders. And so, just do the math on it and look at it from your situation, but challenge. I think as leaders, we need to challenge ourselves around becoming more trusting in order to create the trust that's needed in our world.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, you bring up an interesting point about international differences. We've got audience members in all parts of the globe. And I was surprised just a few weeks ago, I was looking at employee engagement levels in different countries. And the U.S. was about 1 in 3. Now it's down actually a little bit during the pandemic. It had been steadily rising, and then it dropped a couple of points, but still about 1 in 3 employees is considered to be engaged with their work or their workplace.
Yeah.
And I thought, man, that's pretty terrible. But then I looked internationally, and it's about 1 in 5 on average internationally. And in fact, I was working on a virtual talk for an Italian audience, and I looked at Italy, and Italy was actually, I think, the worst country in the EU with about 1 in 20, which is a really kind of an insane number. How do your trust ideas translate into different cultures? Again, that was a great example from France, but will this work everywhere in the world?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. Trust is a universal principle. It applies everywhere. Now, the practices, the applications of how you would implement this are going to be different and vary by country, by culture. Again, cultural context does matter, but the principles are universal. So I've learned if you separate the principle from the practice and from the application, focus on the principle and let people come up with their own practices and applications in their environment, in their construct. So for example, in my book, The Speed of Trust, one of the behaviors that builds trust is to talk straight. That's a behavior, a manifestation of a principle. The principle behind talk straight is truth. I'm trying to convey truth. But talk straight is going to look different, let's say, in the Netherlands than it might look in Japan. The Dutch are notorious straight talkers. There's an expression that goes, nothing offends the Dutch. So you can be very blunt and just, talk straight is just to the point, blunt in the Netherlands. In Japan, you'd be far more nuanced on how you would approach it, lest you be offensive and actually lose effectiveness. But the principle is truth. You're trying to convey truth. But the context and the cultural manifestations of that principle are going to vary in different societies, different places. But I have personally presented on trust in 55 countries, personally on site, in person, as well as another 20 or so virtually to the particular country. And I find that the principles around trust are universal. The practices, the applications, the context is very cultural. And so I've just learned to separate the principle from the practice. And if you do that, then you let people come up with their own practices, own applications in the context of their culture. And then you don't confuse the two. And people can then focus on the principle and not get lost by saying, that won't work here. when in fact the principle will work, but that practice may not work there. You're right. So that's a key distinction that as a global audience, you'll find trust is a universal principle. How we implement and apply it might vary in different cultures and contexts.
Stephen, the book is Trust and Inspire, and those two words aren't exactly parallels or sort of counterparts to each other. Trust can be a behavior. I can behave in a trustworthy way. I can extend trust, even if maybe it's a little bit uncomfortable at first, but I can show trust in other people and see what happens. So that's maybe a relatively simple, maybe not all that simple. I'm sure you found behavior modification. But inspire seems like it would require more charisma, more of a authority role. How do you inspire? What are some steps that people can take to match up with the inspire part?
Beautiful. I love this question. Let me first pivot back and just say this, that the idea of trust and inspire is kind of a leadership style in contrast to the traditional style of command and control. And so I came up with the phrase trust and inspire in juxtaposition and contrast to command and control, which is most people would get command and control. We've grown up in it. It was a relic of the industrial age, and yet it still remains the prevailing style of leadership. We've just become better at it, more enlightened. So I'm suggesting we need to shift from command and control to trust and inspire. So the trust, you're right. We get that. We got to be trusting. But you're asking the question, how do you inspire? Don't you have to be charismatic? And I'm making the point that we need to separate inspiring others from charisma. They're not the same. And I know a lot of people who are charismatic, but who don't inspire at all. I know other people who no one would call charismatic necessarily, but who are extremely inspiring because of who they are and how they lead and how they care about people and others and how they're tied to a purpose and how they help connect you to purpose. They can be very inspiring. So the premise is that inspiring others is actually a learnable skill. Everyone can inspire. And how you inspire when you model the behavior. When you live by your values and you model the behavior, that inspires people. You inspire when you trust people. In fact, I like to say this, to be trusted is the most inspiring form of human motivation. It brings out the best in people. They rise to the occasion. They're inspired by it. So already, those are the first two steps of becoming a trust-inspired leader. You model, you trust. That already helps you start to inspire. You're halfway home, halfway there. But what brings you home, what really completes this is you inspire others when you connect with people and connect to purpose. And so you connect with people through caring and belonging, caring at the personal level, relationship, showing that you care and really demonstrating that concern, that care, the love, whatever you might call it, but it's caring. That actually inspires people when they feel like you care about them. It's like the expression goes, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. It's really true. It's simple, but true. Caring inspires. And then when you connect people to purpose, to meaning, to contribution, that inspires as well. And the premise is that we can learn to create and embed purpose, meaning, and contribution into almost any role, into almost any organization, and inspire people. And so inspiring others is a learnable skill. It's a competency, and it's a source of huge competitive advantage in our world today, because people don't want to be managed. People want to be led. They want to be trusted. They want to be inspired. We all do. I do. You do. And when you're inspired, our listeners do. When people are inspired, that motivates to another level. It is just different in kind, and it's even it's another level beyond engagement. A new frontier of engagement is inspiration, but it is a paradigm shift that everyone can inspire. It's not just for the charismatic, But you can learn how through connecting with people, connecting to purpose. That's learnable. And that's exciting.
What I hear you saying, Stephen, is that it isn't necessarily all about something innate in your personality, but you can adopt behaviors that will inspire. So that too can be a behavior. If you behave in a trusting manner, if you behave in a caring manner, and of course behave yourself in a trustworthy manner, all those things will be serve as inspiration to those around you. So,
absolutely.
Speaking of inspiration, one mutual inspiration that we have is Dilbert, the cartoon series, and one of the very few illustrations in your book is a Dilbert cartoon about working from home, and I think we're now at a transition point or an inflection point where the pandemic does seem to be winding down. I hope I'm not jinxing us here by saying that, and companies are thinking about returning to the office. And it's the approach is varied from companies saying, okay, you will be back in the office. So work from home was an aberration that we're going to fix versus, some companies that are being very flexible with their employees, and employee reaction is different too. Some employees can't wait to get back in. Others say, hey, this really works better with my lifestyle. And a key element in this, though, I think, is trust. What's your take on this when you're talking to companies that are going through this kind of transition now to a post-pandemic world? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that there are multiple right answers. There's many right answers. It's going to vary, and we're going to see some combination of intentionally flexible work, some hybrid work, some combinations, and it's hard to give a one size fits all on that. Context will matter. The nature of the work matters, the company, different approaches. Here's one thing that will be common though, across the board, whether it's come back to the office, everyone, or it's work. I just was with last week a company that's 100% remote. They were created during the pandemic. They've never been together in person until this conference, and 100% remote, and then some hybrids. And I think most will go to a hybrid. But here's the key thing: I could do any of those approaches, and still, I could trust my people or not trust my people in all of those approaches. I mean, we've seen during the pandemic people working from home, and many still not feeling trusted, even though they're working from home. And that was the Dilbert cartoon I put in there. They're just kind of now being micromanaged from a distance. But I've also seen people working from home where the company has built enormous trust because they have declared their intent to their people. We trust you. And the people feel trusted, and they've responded to that. And so whether it's working from home or working on site or a hybrid, the question is, are we leading out in trusting people and in extending that trust? Because when you do, people receive it and they return it. There's a reciprocity of trust. When we don't trust people, they tend to not trust us back. Like you, I've worked all over the world, and I found this, that in low trust companies, the number one reason why employees don't trust their management is first and foremost because the management doesn't trust the employees, and the employees reciprocate that distrust right back at them. Same thing can happen with partners, customers, but it works the other direction. So while distrust is contagious, so is trust. You tell your people you trust them, and it's not just words, it's actions. It's a smart trust with expectations and accountability. And certainly working from home or remote work or hybrid work can be all of that, as well as on-site work. I trust you, and I extend the trust with expectations and accountability, and I create an agreement around that, and I let you govern yourself against the agreement, manage yourself against the agreement. You report back as we agreed. And that is an extraordinary approach that will work in our current world and in any future world of hybrid or what have you, because ultimately, people don't want to be managed. They want to be led. They want to be trusted in any of these scenarios. And so that's why this approach is going to be far more relevant. A new world of work requires a new way to lead. And you can't do it through command and control. You can't command and control your way to a great culture, and you can't command and control your way to collaboration and innovation. You got to do it through trust and inspire. And you got to trust people, and then you got to seek out to inspire them in the ways we talked about: connecting with people through caring, connecting to purpose, meaning, contribution. That inspires. We can do this. It's learnable. And it's the kind of leadership that's needed in our world today. And traditional command and control leaders, even enlightened ones, are going to become increasingly irrelevant and not able to connect to this new world of work, and also to this new generation of workers and people, and what they're seeking and wanting, and how best to bring out the best in people. It's just a new environment. We need a new way to lead in this new world.
That's great. That's probably a pretty good place to wrap up, Stephen. How can our audience members find you and your ideas online?
You can go to trustandinspire.com, the name of this new book. And there's a whole host of ideas, both for Trust and Inspire, as well as for Speed of Trust, and all my work, and some videos and some different things that you can get and learn. And then the book is out. It's out just this month, and it's everywhere available. And I think it's really practical and tangible, because people, want to get into real action and practice. And at one level, as you know, these ideas, just like the ideas you work on with friction, that it's kind of like common sense, but it's not common practice. And the common practice tends to be a counterfeit version of it, or we're just not quite doing it. So to know and not to do is not to know. So the whole idea of the book is to try to say, yeah, we know this, but we're not doing it. Here's some ideas to help us become a trust and inspire leader by modeling, by trusting, by inspiring. And that's the point, that we can get good at this. We can learn to do this. We can re-script ourselves and our leadership style. And it's needed now more than ever before.
Great. I love that. Common sense is not common practice. So true. And we will link to the places that you mentioned on the show notes page at rogerdooley.com/podcast, where we'll have audio, video, and text versions of this conversation. And Stephen, it's been a real pleasure having you on. I know that we could have gone for hours here. I think you guys a lot in common, but we hope to have you back on the show before too long.
Yeah, I'd love to do it. Really admire you, Roger, your work that you're doing in marketing and everything else, as well as Friction and your other works, as well as this podcast, Brainfluence podcast. This is exciting. What a thrill to be with you. Thank you.